Clara had learned early in life that some people were considered blessings, while others were seen as burdens. She had been marked as the latter, born into a family that valued children for the work they could provide in the fields and for the grandchildren they might one day bring. Clara's worth had always been measured against things she could not yet give. She was quiet, small-boned, and slow to grow. When she reached 16 and still had not been courted or married off, whispers started, cruel remarks that slipped into conversations like snakes through grass. "Perhaps she's barren," her mother once muttered when she thought Clara couldn't hear. "What use is a daughter who can't give a man heirs?" Those words burrowed deep into Clara's heart. Though she had no reason to believe them, she carried the weight of that judgment everywhere she went. It wasn't long before her parents, strapped for coin and tired of mouths to feed, left her in the care of distant kin. To them, she was one. Less responsibility. To Clara, it was proof that she had never truly belonged. Life with her guardians was little better. They were not cruel in open ways, but their indifference stung worse than any harshness. She was fed, clothed, and housed, but she was never embraced, never comforted. Her place in their home was clear. She was there to work. At dawn, she rose to tend chickens, fetch water, and scrub the floors. At dusk, she stitched until her eyes blurred. Day after day, she moved quietly in the background, invisible unless something needed doing. But Clara was not without spirit. When her hands worked, her mind wandered, spinning daydreams of a different life. In those quiet hours, she imagined a home where laughter filled the rooms, where someone cared when she was tired or sick, where she was not just needed for what she could do, but wanted for who she was. These dreams gave her strength, though she dared not speak them aloud. The years passed, and Clara blossomed into a young woman. Her hair, a deep chestnut, caught glimmers of gold in the sun. Her eyes, though shadowed with sorrow, held a softness that children and animals seemed to trust instinctively. Yet her guardians only saw what they had always believed: a girl with no dowry, no prospects, and no value. As debts mounted, they began to see her not as kin, but as an asset to be bargained. Clara overheard them one evening as she carried laundry inside. The husband's voice was low and tight, thick with frustration. "We can't keep scraping by like this. That girl eats more than she earns us. Maybe someone would take her off our hands, for the right price." The wife didn't argue. She simply asked, "And who'd want her?" Clara froze where she stood, her heart pounding. The conversation went on, their voices fading as they moved to another room, but the meaning was clear enough. They planned to sell her, not marry her off with dignity, not seek her happiness, but trade her as one might a mule or a cow. That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, above her cot. Fear clawed at her chest, but beneath it flickered something else: resolve. She would not let herself be sold. She would not surrender her fate to people who had never once seen her as more than a burden. If she stayed, she would be trapped forever, bartered away to someone who saw her as nothing more than property. If she left, there was danger, yes, but also the slimmest chance of freedom. The decision settled in her bones. Tomorrow, she would begin to prepare. She had little to her name: an old satchel, a thin blanket, a small loaf of bread she could tuck away. But she had her determination, and that, she told herself, was worth more than anything her guardians thought they could gain from selling her. The morning after Clara made her silent vow to run, the household went about its business as though nothing were amiss. Chickens clucked, the air smelled of damp hay, and her guardians spoke in clipped tones about debts and weather. Yet Clara's ears picked up every nuance, every sharp word. The conversation she had overheard the night before had cracked something inside her. She could not look at them the same way again. Later that evening, when she returned from gathering firewood, she paused by the open window of the main room. The glow of lamplight spilled across the yard, and inside she saw her guardians seated at the rough-hewn table. Spread before them were papers, a bottle of cheap whiskey, and an expression on the man's face that made her stomach clench. He was bargaining. A girl of age, strong, knows her way around a kitchen, her guardian was saying. His voice carried a slick tone he usually reserved for traders at the market. She can cook, mend, and work the fields if needed. Not much of a dowry, but worth something to a man alone. Clara's blood ran cold. She stepped closer, unable to stop herself. The man across from him, a rancher she recognized from the outskirts of town, nodded slowly. "What are you asking?" Her guardian leaned forward, lowering his voice as though speaking of contraband. $5. Enough to settle part of what I owe you. The rancher frowned. 5? For a girl? She's no prized bride, thin as a rail, no land to her name. How do I know she's fit? She'll do, her guardian snapped, though his eyes shifted uneasily. She'll do fine. Clara's breath caught in her throat. $5. That was what her life was worth. $5 to erase part of a debt, like a sack of grain or a lame horse. She stumbled back into the shadows, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the bundle of firewood. The words looped in her mind. She'll do. $5. Rage welled up, hotter than anything she had ever known. She wanted to burst through the door, to shout at them, to demand if this was truly all she was to them. But another feeling followed swiftly. Fear. If they saw her as nothing more than a bargain, what would happen if she protested? What would happen if the rancher agreed and came for her tomorrow? That night, as she lay on her cot, Clara stared into the dark and let tears streak silently down her face. She had never asked for much. She hadn't expected love from her guardians, nor gifts, nor kindness. But to be sold like livestock, it was more humiliation than she could bear. Yet in that humiliation, resolve hardened further. She had to leave. Not tomorrow, not after a few more days of preparing, but soon. Perhaps even tonight. Her satchel lay hidden beneath her thin mattress, already holding the bread she had squirreled away. She had filled a canteen earlier when no one was watching. A length of rope, stolen from the barn, was coiled tightly at the bottom. She rose quietly, her heart pounding in her ears. Moonlight slanted through the window, silvering the floorboards. Every creak of the wood beneath her feet felt like thunder. She slipped her shoes on, tied the satchel across her chest, and took one last look at the room where she had spent so many years. No memories tethered her there. No warmth held her back. The walls that had contained her laughter when she was small had become a prison. Moving quickly, she slid out the door and into the night. The cool air brushed her face, carrying the scent of grass and far-off pine. For a moment, she stood still, drinking it in, the taste of freedom. But behind her, in that dimly lit room, men were bargaining for her life. Clara whispered into the dark, as if making a vow to herself. I will not be bought. I will not be sold. Then she turned and walked toward the horizon, each step carrying her further from the cruel bargain that had almost claimed her, and closer to a fate she had yet to imagine. The night swallowed Clara whole as she slipped beyond the borders of the only place she had ever known. Her breath fogged in the cool air, her satchel bouncing against her hip, each step carrying her farther from the shadow of her guardians. Bargain. The narrow dirt path wound through tall grass, the moon casting a pale glow that turned everything into shades of silver and shadow. At first her legs moved quickly, driven by panic. What if they noticed she was gone? What if they came after her, furious she had ruined their deal? Each sound behind her, an owl hooting, branches snapping, felt like footsteps chasing her. She glanced over her shoulder so often that her neck ached. But as the night deepened, the silence of the wilderness pressed in. The town lights vanished, swallowed by rolling fields, and the path beneath her boots turned rougher, less certain. Her lungs burned. Her body, unused to such desperate movement, begged for rest. Yet she pushed forward, whispering to herself, "Don't stop, Clara. Don't stop now." The satchel grew heavy, though it held only a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and a length of rope. Every ounce of weight seemed magnified in her exhaustion. By the time the moon hung high above, her legs trembled, and she sank to her knees in the grass. The silence around her was so complete, it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. That's when she heard it. A distant howl, low and eerie, carried on the night wind. Wolves. The sound made her skin crawl. Stories she had heard as a child came rushing back. Tales of travelers torn apart when they wandered too far from the safety of town. Clara clutched her satchel and scrambled to her feet, fear giving her legs fresh strength. She hurried onward, stumbling over rocks and roots. The wilderness seemed endless, trees looming like silent sentinels, shadows stretching across her path. Her heart thudded so loudly she wondered if the wolves could hear it too. Hours passed. Fatigue gnawed at her determination. Hunger pinched her stomach, but she dared not stop to eat. She sipped only the smallest amount of water, knowing she had no idea where she was headed or how long her supplies would last. At dawn, the sky softened into shades of pink and gray. Clara's eyes ached with sleeplessness, her steps unsteady. She followed the faint outline of what seemed like a wagon track, though weeds and grass had nearly reclaimed it. Her dress was torn from thorns, her hair tangled, her skin scraped raw where branches had clawed at her arms. By midday, the heat bore down, the sun offering no mercy. Her body screamed for rest, but she feared lying down meant never rising again. She tried to hum to herself, an old tune she barely remembered from her mother's lullabies, but her throat was too dry. The sound came out cracked, almost a sob. And then her foot caught on a stone. She stumbled, arms flailing, and crashed to the ground. The impact jarred through her bones, the breath punched from her chest. For a moment, she simply lay there, cheek pressed to the dirt, staring at ants crawling in a determined line. A bitter thought slipped in. Perhaps I should just stay here. Let the wolves or the heat or the night take me. At least then it will be over. But even as despair whispered, another thought rose louder. If you stop now, Clara, you'll never know what else the world might hold. You'll never find freedom. You'll never find love. That thought, love, was like a spark in the ashes of her spirit. She tried to rise, but her body rebelled. Her limbs felt heavy as stone, her head light as air. Darkness swam at the edges of her vision. She managed to crawl a few feet, dragging herself toward a patch of shade beneath a tree, before her strength gave way entirely. The last thing Clara remembered was the distant sound of hooves, slow, steady, rhythmic. A horse. Someone was coming, down the road. She tried to lift her head, to see, but her body wouldn't obey. Her vision blurred, the world spinning. Then, just before everything went black, she felt herself lifted. Strong arms sliding beneath her, a deep voice murmuring words she couldn't understand. And then there was nothing but the steady thrum of a heartbeat against her ear as she surrendered to the dark. When Clara awoke, the first sensation she felt was warmth, strange and unfamiliar after the cold hardness of the ground she had collapsed on. A soft blanket covered her, the faint scent of wood smoke and leather wrapping around her senses. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind. Where was she? Was she safe? Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing a modest cabin room bathed in the golden glow of a fire. The walls were sturdy but plain, built from pine logs that bore the marks of hard labor. A shelf lined with a few worn books sat in one corner, while tools and saddles leaned against another. On the table nearby lay a tin cup filled with water. Clara pushed herself upright slowly, every muscle aching. She wasn't alone. Across the room, sitting in a chair near the hearth, was a man. He was broad-shouldered, his posture straight but not stiff. A Stetson hat rested on the table beside him, and the firelight carved deep lines into his weathered face. His eyes, gray, steady, and unreadable, were fixed on her. For a moment, Clara's breath caught. She had seen men like him before in passing, cowboys, hardened by sun and solitude, men who lived by the rhythm of the land. But this one seemed different. There was no arrogance in the way he sat, no smirk of triumph at finding her helpless. Instead, there was a quiet watchfulness, as though he were a man accustomed to silence and secrets. "You're awake," he said finally, his voice low and rough, like gravel worn smooth by years of use. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. Where am I?" "My place," he replied simply. "Found you on the trail. You'd have died out there." The words struck her like a hammer. Death had been so close, closer than she dared admit. She glanced down at her hands, trembling, in her lap, then back at the man. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes still locked on hers. When he finally spoke, it was with measured calm. "Would have been wrong to leave you." The simplicity of the answer both comforted and unsettled her. This was a man who did not waste words, who spoke only when he meant to. Clara studied him, cautiously, noticing the small details, the scar running along his jaw, the way his hands, large, calloused, rested steady and still. He was older than her, perhaps in his early 30s, with the air of someone who had endured more than he cared to tell. "My name is Clara," she whispered, as though speaking it aloud would anchor her in this unfamiliar place. "Ethan," he said, offering nothing more. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Clara fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, unsure if she should thank him or apologize for being here at all. Her instinct told her she had stumbled into the home of a man who valued his solitude, who had not asked for company. And yet he had, saved her, carried her here, and watched over her as she slept. Her gaze drifted to the far side of the room, where two small shapes stirred beneath quilts. Children. A boy and a girl, their hair tousled, their cheeks flushed with sleep. Clara's heart tightened, so Ethan was not entirely alone. "They're yours?" she asked softly. He nodded. "My young ones. Their ma." She passed. Grief flickered in his eyes, quick, sharp, and buried again. Clara said nothing, but she felt the weight of it. She knew loss in her own way, though not the kind that left behind children and a silent man to care for them. The little girl stirred, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. She looked at Clara curiously before shuffling over to Ethan and climbing onto his lap. He rested a protective arm around her, his rough exterior softening just slightly. In that moment, Clara understood something vital. This cowboy was not just silent by nature. He was silent because of wounds that words could not mend. "I'll go," Clara said suddenly, though the thought filled her with dread. "I didn't mean to trouble you. I'll find my way." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You can't. Walk out of here yet. You're weak. Rest first." There was no room for argument in his tone, not harsh, but firm, like the ground beneath her feet. Clara lowered her gaze, torn between gratitude and unease. She had run from one prison only, to collapse into the care of a stranger. But something about Ethan, his steadiness, his refusal to pry, the way his children clung to him, whispered that this place might not be a prison at all. As the fire crackled and the cabin walls held her safe, Clara allowed her body to relax, just slightly. Perhaps fate had not abandoned her after all. Perhaps in the arms of the silent cowboy, she had stumbled onto the first step of a life she could not yet imagine. Clara woke to the sound of clattering dishes and soft voices. For a moment, she lay still beneath the quilt, her mind struggling to recall where she was. Then it came rushing back, the wilderness, the collapse, and the silent cowboy who had carried her into safety. Slowly she sat up. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, painting the wooden walls with a soft golden glow. The room smelled of coffee and frying bacon, a scent so rich it made Clara's stomach twist with hunger. She hadn't eaten since she fled, save for a small nibble of bread. She slid her feet to the floor, embarrassed by how shaky she felt, and glanced toward the table. Ethan sat at the head, sipping coffee. His gray eyes flicked toward her, acknowledging her presence without a word. At his side, the two children were awake now, the boy perhaps 8, the girl a little younger. They whispered and giggled together, casting curious glances at Clara. Their eyes filled with both caution and intrigue. Clara smoothed her tangled hair and folded her hands in her lap. She wasn't sure what to say or do. This was not her home. She was a stranger here, an intruder. She felt the old familiar weight of being unwanted creeping over her. "Sit," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but not unkind. He motioned to an empty chair at the table. Clara hesitated, then obeyed. The wooden chair creaked beneath her as she settled into it. A plate was set before her, heaped with bacon and cornbread. The smell was so tempting that her hands trembled. When she reached for the fork, she hesitated, glancing at Ethan. "Go on," he said, eyes steady on her. She nodded quickly, then took a bite. The flavor was warm, filling, almost overwhelming after the lean meals she had known. Tears stung her eyes, surprising her. She blinked them back before anyone could notice. The little girl, perched beside Ethan, leaned forward on her elbows. "What's your name?" she asked. "Clara," she whispered. Her voice cracked, unused to such gentle curiosity. The boy studied her with narrowed eyes. "You don't look like you're from around here." I suppose I'm not," she admitted. She didn't know how much to reveal. She feared that if she spoke of being sold, Ethan would think less of her. The children pressed with more questions, their curiosity unfiltered, but Ethan silenced them with a quiet look. "Eat," he said again, this time to the children. They obeyed, though their eyes still darted toward Clara. When the meal was done, Clara tried to rise, intent on clearing the plates, but her knees buckled beneath her. She caught herself against the table, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Ethan stood, steadying her with one strong hand. "You're not fit for work yet," he said. "Rest." "I can help," she insisted, her voice shaking. "Please, I don't want to be a burden." His expression didn't soften, but his hand lingered just a moment before he let go. "No one said you were." The words pierced her heart more than he could know. Never in her life had she heard such a thing. She sank back into the chair, overwhelmed. For the next few days, Clara remained in the cabin. Ethan went about his chores, tending the horses and checking the fences, while the children did small tasks. Clara, though weak, began to find small ways to contribute. She mended a tear in the little girl's dress, washed the dishes, and swept the floor. At first, Ethan didn't comment, but she caught him watching her from time to time, his gray eyes unreadable. The children warmed to her, quickly. They followed her as she moved about, asking her to tell them stories. Clara spun simple tales of birds who flew across the mountains, of rivers that whispered secrets if you listened closely. The children laughed, their eyes bright, their giggles filling the cabin with a warmth Clara hadn't realized it lacked. It was in those moments that she felt a stirring in her heart. She didn't belong here, not really, but for the first time she felt useful, wanted in small ways. One evening, as she stirred stew over the fire, she whispered aloud, half to herself, "I can cook. I can care for children. I just don't. Want to be left behind again?" She hadn't realized Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the silence between them. For Clara, those days of shelter were a fragile miracle. She had stumbled into a stranger's home, but slowly she was beginning to feel that perhaps the days turned into a rhythm Clara had never known before. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, the children's laughter echoing softly, and the quiet strength of Ethan's presence anchoring everything. It was a life that felt at once simple and extraordinary, so different from the years she had spent as a burden in other people's homes. Here, she wasn't scolded or dismissed. She wasn't sold off or silenced. She was simply allowed to be. Yet Clara could not shake the fear that it was temporary. She worked harder than her body sometimes allowed, pushing herself to cook, clean, mend, and tend to the children as though proving her worth. Each loaf of bread she baked, each patched shirt, each story told to the children before bed was not just an act of kindness. It was a plea to stay, a plea not to be cast out once she had recovered her strength. Ethan, ever the silent. Cowboy gave no clear answer. His words were few, his expressions unreadable, but his actions told a different story. When Clara rose too quickly and swayed with dizziness, his hand was there at her elbow, steady and sure. When she fretted over the thinness of the stew, he ladled himself a second helping and ate without complaint. When she bent to gather wood, he wordlessly carried the heavier load. It was in those small acts that Clara began to glimpse something beyond obligation, perhaps even care. Still, she couldn't bring herself to believe it fully. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Clara lingered by the fire, mending a sock. The steady scrape of Ethan sharpening his knife filled the silence. She glanced at him, the eye, firelight catching the hard angles of his face. He looked worn, not only from labor but from a sorrow she couldn't name. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Ethan, may I ask you something?" He looked up, gray eyes steady on her. "Go on." She lowered her gaze to the sock in her lap. "Why did you let me stay? You don't know me. You didn't owe me anything." The silence stretched. Clara's heart pounded, afraid she had pried too deeply. Then his voice came, low but sure. "Didn't see a stranger that night, just someone who needed help." Her hands stilled on the fabric. She wanted to believe him, but old doubts clawed their way back. "I can cook," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can care for children. I can even bear them if God wills it. But please, just don't leave me. I couldn't bear that." Again. The words slipped out before she could stop them, raw and aching. Her eyes burned with tears and shame flushed her cheeks. She had revealed too much, shown too much need. She braced herself for rejection, for the tightening of his jaw, the look that said she was too much, not enough, or both. But Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't mock or scold. Instead, he set the knife aside and leaned forward, his elbows on, his knees. "You've been left behind before," he said quietly, not as a question but as an understanding. Clara nodded, unable to speak. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a small shake of his head. "I don't walk away easy." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise carved in stone. But to Clara, it was more than she had ever been given. That night, as she lay beneath her quilt, she stared at the ceiling, her heart both lighter and heavier. A fragile hope had taken root inside her, delicate as a new sprout, vulnerable to being crushed, but alive nonetheless. Perhaps she wasn't just passing through this place, Perhaps in time she might belong. Still, fear lingered. Love was something she had dreamed of but never known. To hope for it now felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff and trusting the air to hold her. And yet, when Ethan's quiet voice echoed in her memory, "I don't walk away easy," she clung to it as though it were the first real anchor she had ever been given. Just perhaps, she was no longer a stranger at all. For weeks, Clara felt as though she lived in a fragile dream. The cabin bustled with life, not in a noisy or overwhelming way, but in the rhythm of shared work, shared meals, and the soft comfort of the children's laughter. She had begun to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, this could be her home. But the past has a way of finding those who try to outrun it. It began with whispers in town. Ethan made regular trips for supplies, flour, coffee, nails, and the few necessities that couldn't be made or grown on the homestead. He never spoke much when he was there, but people noticed the quiet cowboy's life had changed. He now purchased a little more flour, an extra length of cloth, more sugar than usual. Folks in small towns were curious by nature, and curiosity turned into gossip. One evening, when Ethan returned from town, his jaw was tighter than usual. He unloaded the wagon in silence, but Clara noticed the stiffness in his movements. Later, when the children were tucked in, she asked gently, "Something wrong?" He shook his head at first, but his gray eyes betrayed him. After a long pause, he muttered, "They know about you." Her heart sank. "Who?" "Your kin, or the ones you were staying with." Words spread. Clara's breath caught. She felt as though the walls of the cabin were closing in. They're looking for me?" Ethan didn't answer directly, which told her enough. His silence was heavier than words. The days that followed were filled with unease. Clara continued her chores, but her hands trembled as she kneaded bread. She laughed with the children, but the sound rang hollow in her own ears. Each time a rider passed on the distant road, she stiffened, certain they had come for her. At night, fear gnawed at her. She imagined being dragged back to her guardian's house, sold off to a man who would see her only as property. Worse, she imagined Ethan standing by, helpless, or worse still, unwilling to stop it. After all, what claim did she have here? She was not his wife. She was not his kin. She was a stranger who had stumbled onto his land. One night, unable to sleep, Clara sat by the fire long after everyone else had gone to bed. She stared at the flames, her thoughts circling like vultures. When Ethan came in from checking the barn, he found her hunched over, eyes wet with unshed tears. "You're thinking of running again," he said quietly. Clara flinched, startled by how easily he had read her heart. "I can't bring you trouble," she whispered. "You've done enough for me already." "If they come here, it'll be my fault. People will talk. Maybe worse." Ethan set down his hat and leaned against the mantel, his eyes fixed on the fire. "You'd leave the children? They've taken to you." Her throat tightened. She thought of their small hands in hers, their sleepy smiles, the way they listened with rapt attention to her bedtime stories. Leaving them would break her heart, but staying might ruin Ethan's reputation and bring scandal to his door. "I don't belong here," she said at last, her voice cracking. His gaze finally shifted to her, sharp and steady. "You belong where you're wanted. And you're wanted here." The words struck her like a blow, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks. But even as warmth spread through her chest, doubt lingered. Want was fleeting. She had been wanted before, briefly, only to be cast aside when usefulness faded. Could she trust that Ethan's words meant more? The next day, her fears were realized. A rider came to the cabin, one of her guardian's acquaintances. He carried himself with the smug confidence of a man who thought he held power. The girls, ours, he declared, his eyes raking over Clara. She was promised, and we've come to collect. Clara's stomach dropped. She felt the old panic rising, the desperate urge to flee. She looked to Ethan, searching for an answer, a sign. His jaw tightened, his hand brushing the edge of his holster in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable. For the first time since she had arrived, Clara realized the depth of the choice before her. She could run, as she had always done, or she could stay and trust Ethan to stand for her. That night, after the man had gone, Clara sat in the quiet cabin with her heart thundering. The whispers of her past had found her, threatening to drag her back into chains. But for the first time, she wasn't alone in facing them. And though fear still lingered, so too did the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who would fight to keep her. The writer's visit had left the cabin in a hush of tension. Clara moved through the days afterward like a ghost, her hands busy with cooking and cleaning, but her mind consumed with dread. Each time she stepped outside, she half expected another man to ride up demanding her return. Each time Ethan left for town, she feared he would come back changed. His silence no longer the quiet she had come to trust, but the cold withdrawal of a man forced into a corner. The children sensed it too. They clung to Clara more than ever. The little girl curling into her lap at night, the boy watching the door with narrowed eyes as though ready to defend the only home he knew. Their innocent faith in her steadied Clara, but it also broke her. What if she couldn't stay? What if she was torn away from them? One evening, Ethan returned from town later than usual. His shoulders were taut, his jaw set like stone. Clara was mending by the fire when he entered, and her needle stilled in her hand. She didn't dare ask. "They were there," he said finally, hanging his hat on the peg. "Your kin, waiting for me." Clara's stomach clenched. "What did they say?" "That you're theirs," Ethan replied, his voice low, controlled. "That you owe them. That they've a right to sell you as they please." The words made her chest tighten with shame and fury. "And you? What did you say?" For a long moment, Ethan didn't answer. He moved slowly, methodically, pouring himself a cup of coffee as though the conversation were about nothing more than weather. The silence stretched until Clara thought she might burst. Finally, he turned to her, gray eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. "I told them no one lays claim to you. Not now. Not ever." Her breath caught. "They tried to laugh it off," Ethan continued. "Said I was just a fool of a cowboy keeping a runaway. Said I'd bring shame on myself." His jaw tightened further. "So I told them plain in front of half the town. Clara stays with me. Anyone who thinks otherwise can take it up with me directly." Clara's needle slipped from her fingers, landing on the quilt. She could hardly breathe. No one had ever spoken for her before. Not her parents, not her guardians, not a soul in her past life. She had always been the girl left behind, the girl no one wanted. And here was Ethan, quiet and steady Ethan, standing before men in town and declaring she was his to protect. Her lips trembled. Why would you do that?" He set the cup down with a soft clink and moved closer. His voice dropped, steady but rough with emotion. "Because you belong here, with me, with the children, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you. Away!" Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart thundering. She had imagined this moment in dreams, the idea of someone choosing her, claiming her, not as property, but as family. Yet the reality of it left her undone. Ethan knelt in front of her, his large, work-roughened hands resting on his knees. He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her, but his eyes held hers with unshakable certainty. "I know what it's like to lose someone," he said quietly. "I won't lose you too." Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to throw herself into his arms and let his strength shield her from every shadow, but fear still coiled tight within her. Words were fragile things. Promises had been broken before. Yet Ethan's words didn't feel fragile. They felt like bedrock, firm, immovable. She whispered, barely audible, "I've never been worth fighting for." Ethan shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "You're worth more than you know, and I'll prove it every day as long as it takes." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, its glow wrapping around them both. For the first time since she had fled into the wilderness, Clara felt something stronger than fear. She felt seen, she felt chosen, and in that moment, though the threat of her past still lingered, Clara began to believe in something new, the possibility of a future not defined by abandonment, but by love strong enough to fight for her place in the world. The storm of confrontation passed, but the air around the ranch was changed. Ethan had stood tall before men who wished to claim Clara like she was cattle, and he had spoken words that no one had ever spoken for her before. Still, even as the dust settled, Clara carried doubts like stones in her pocket. Yes, Ethan had defended her. Yes, he had said she belonged here. But did he mean it from his heart? Or was she just a woman filling the empty spaces in his life, a cook for his meals, a caretaker for his children, a companion in the silence of his evenings? The days continued with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Clara rose with the dawn, stirring oatmeal over the fire, braiding the little girl's hair, and teaching the boy his letters at the table while Ethan saddled horses outside. She mended clothes, kept the cabin warm, and worked in the garden. But all the while her heart wrestled with the same question. Was she truly wanted or simply needed? One crisp autumn morning, Clara stood by the line of laundry flapping in the breeze. She paused with a sheet in her hands, staring out at the horizon where the golden fields met the endless blue sky. A fear twisted inside her. If he only needs me for work, then when the children are grown, when he no longer requires my hands, will he cast me aside too? That night, Ethan returned later than usual. Clara had left stew warming on the stove and sat by the fire with her sewing. When he came in, his clothes dusted from the trail, she noticed a small tear in his sleeve. Without a word, she set aside her work, fetched her basket of thread, and began stitching the rip. Ethan watched her, quiet as ever, until finally he said, "You're always fixing what's broken." She looked up, startled, meeting his steady gaze. "Clothes, meals, children," he went on. His lips twitched, almost a smile. "Me." Her cheeks warmed, but she shook her head. "I only do what I can. I've nothing else to offer." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's where you're wrong. You give this place life again." Clara froze, her needle hovering in midair. He didn't stop there. He told her how, after his wife's death, the cabin had been nothing more than walls and wood, filled with silence heavier than grief. How the children had gone to bed hungry some nights, not for lack of food, but for lack of warmth. How he himself had felt half dead, just going through the motions of survival. "And then you came," he said, voice rough but steady. "You laugh with the children. You sing while you work. You've turned this house into a home." Tears pricked Clara's eyes, but still the fear lingered. "But what if one day you don't want me here?" she whispered. Ethan's brows drew together. He reached across, taking her hand in his large, calloused one. His thumb brushed over her knuckles with surprising gentleness. "Clara, I don't want you here because of what you do. I want you here because of who you are." The words sank into her like rain on dry earth. She had never in all her life been told she was enough simply as herself. Her guardians had measured her worth by chores done, by the prospect of children she could bear, by her usefulness to them. But Ethan, this quiet, scarred cowboy, saw her differently. In the days that followed, his actions spoke even louder than his words. He repaired the frayed shawl she wore, stitching it carefully when he thought she wouldn't notice. He began teaching her to ride, patient and calm, so she could join him on the range instead of being left behind. And in the evenings, when the children were asleep, he would sit beside her by the fire, their hands brushing together, until finally he began holding her hand outright. It wasn't grand gestures or poetic declarations. It was steady, enduring, proof that he meant what he said. For Clara, the shift was slow but undeniable. Each small act of care chipped away at the fear that she was only temporary, only tolerated. Each moment of quiet companionship wove her more firmly into the fabric of the family. One night, as the children giggled in their beds and the fire cast its glow across the cabin walls, Clara realized something extraordinary. She was no longer waiting for the moment she would be sent away. For the first time, she let herself imagine years ahead, birthdays, seasons turning, laughter echoing in these walls. And she wasn't a bystander in that picture. She was part of it. The first frost touched the fields, glazing the tall grass in silver. Winter was coming, and with it, long nights by the fire, hearty meals, and the comfort of family gathered close. For Clara, the cold season no longer loomed like a threat. Instead, it promised warmth she had never known before, not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the steady presence of Ethan and the children. Still, one fear lingered in her heart. She had spoken once of her willingness to cook, to bear children, to do whatever it took so that she would not be left behind. Ethan had fought for her, had spoken words that felt like iron, had even shown her through his actions that she was wanted. But Clara longed for something more. Confirmation that her place here was not conditional, not dependent on usefulness or necessity, but born from love. That assurance came on an evening soft with snow. Clara stood at the stove, ladling stew into bowls while the fire crackled and the children played a game on the rug. The cabin glowed with the kind of warmth she once believed she would never have. She caught herself humming, and the realization startled her. She was happy. Truly, deeply happy. Ethan came in from the barn, brushing snow from his shoulders. His cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes softened when they landed on her. He helped settle the children at the table, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he tucked the girl's braid behind her shoulder. The simple sight filled Clara's chest with a fullness that brought tears to her eyes. Later, when the children were asleep, Ethan remained by the fire while Clara tidied up. She moved quietly, but he noticed everything, how she paused to fold a quilt, how she smoothed her skirt nervously. Finally, she joined him, sitting on the rug where the warmth of the fire kissed her cheeks. For a long time, silence stretched between them, but it was not the uneasy silence of strangers. It was the comfortable quiet of two souls learning to breathe together. Still, Clara's heart pounded. She thought of the words she had once whispered to him in fear. "I can cook. I can bear children. Just don't leave me." The memory burned. She didn't want to be wanted for service or survival. She wanted to be loved. Ethan must have sensed her unease. He reached for her hand, enveloping it in his calloused palm. "You're thinking hard again?" he murmured. Clara managed a trembling smile. "I was just remembering what I said that night, how desperate I was, how I begged you not to leave me." His thumb brushed her hand. "I remember." Shame pricked her eyes with tears. "I was so afraid. All my life I've been something to trade, something to use. I thought, if I could just prove myself useful, someone might keep me. That's why I said those words." She swallowed hard. "But I don't want to be kept like that. Not anymore." Ethan turned to face her fully, the firelight casting shadows across his rugged features. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of truth. Clara, listen to me. You're not here because of what you can do. You're here because you're you. Because when you laugh, the house feels alive again. Because when you hold the children, they feel safe. Because when you sit by the fire, I don't feel alone. Her tears slipped free, warm against her cheeks. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. I loved once before, and I lost her. I thought my heart had nothing left to give. But you've proven me wrong. Clara, I love you, not for what you do, not for what you might give me, just for being you. The words, simple, unadorned, fell over her like a blessing. Clara's breath hitched, her heart opening wide to receive them. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such quiet certainty. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I love you too, she whispered. The moment stretched, tender and eternal. Ethan drew her into his arms, holding her with a strength that felt like a vow. The fire flickered, the snow fell silently outside, and Clara knew with absolute certainty. She was no longer unwanted, no longer a runaway girl searching for a place to belong. She was home. The story closed not with grand gestures, but with the gentle truth of love's whisper, two hearts, scarred but steadfast, choosing each other beneath the wide western sky.